In this edition of Take Two.
Come close, Morris, so I can see you.
Here.
It's been so long.
A famous and much-loved actress of the 1950s and 60s, with an equally famous and much-loved mother. Returning to Elstree, where she appeared with some of the great acting talent of the 20th century.
Who knew he was going to end up as President of the United States?
To tell us all about what went on in front of and behind the camera, welcome Janette Scott. Well, it's lovely to have you back here, Janette, after all these years here at Elstree Studios. And we'll talk about some of your Elstree films a little later on. First of all, perhaps tell us a little bit about how you got into the business in the first place.
Well, let's see. I was born in Morecambe in Lancashire, but I was the daughter of a very theatrical family. My darling mum, Thora Hurd, and her parents before her. And on my father's side, he was a musician, and his father had also been a musician playing music for silent films. So it was the family business, entertainment anyway, and really it was a question of having nowhere to put me when I was about 2 years old. My mother was down at Ealing Studios. World War II had started good and proper, and she would pine for me because she'd left me up in the north being safe, and every once in a while I would be brought down to London, and she would take me to the studios and leave me in the wardrobe, and not a wardrobe with doors, I mean the wardrobe with the wardrobe ladies, when she went on the set. And the first film I was ever in was a film called Went the Day Well. I was 2 years old. It was directed by a man called Cavalcanti, who got very angry at a child they had hired because the child kept on screaming every time the camera that was on a crane came low down to take a picture of him. So Cavalcanti said, "Get that child off the set," which was fine, except then everyone looked at each other and said, "Well, what do we do for a child that was needed in the scene?" And my mum said, "Well, I've got one in wardrobe." And I was brought out, and that was my very first day of filming. I think I've got the little wage chit for it still that my mother stuck in my baby book of pictures.
Was it something very early on that you knew that you wanted to do, or did you just find yourself in that life?
As I said, it was the family business. I don't think I ever thought of doing anything else, Morris. It was, well, the time that I got really seriously into the business, I mean really doing it, once again, World War II had just finished this time. Once again, my mother didn't have anywhere to put me, so she took me to Golden Square, where the head of many of the film corporations had their offices, and she was going to be seen for a part in a film. She left me in the waiting room while she went in to be auditioned or interviewed, whatever, and Robert Leonard, who was the head of casting for Associated British Pictures, happened to be walking to his office through the waiting room, saw this little 6-year-old sitting all by herself and started talking to me. He asked my name. And of course I said Janette Scott, which is my name. That didn't really register with him because my mother was Thora Hurd. So he sat and chatted to me for a considerable time. Then my mother came out and claimed me. And the last words Robert Leonard said to me that day was, "If ever I need a little girl in a film, I'll remember you." And I said, "Thank you very much, bye-bye." 3 years later, he telephoned my mother and said, "Have you still got that little girl?" And my mother said, "Yes, but she's a big girl now. She's 9 years old." And he said, "We're making a film at Elstree Studios called No Place for Jennifer, about a little girl. Do you think she could be seen for the part of Jennifer? Nothing ventured, nothing gained. My mother said, all right. I was seen with about 100 other girls, down to the final dozen, down to the final 4. The final 4, including myself, were screen tested at Elstree. I got the part, I got a 10-year contract, and grew up at Elstree Studios.
So this became your second home?
Absolutely, absolutely. This preview theatre that we're sitting in now, I used to hide in here to keep away from my tutor so I wouldn't have to do lessons in between shots. And I would also spend a lot of time in the cutting rooms, the editing rooms, little realising that, in fact, by being in places like this, seeing them put the sound and the music on films and being in the editing rooms, I was learning far more than I possibly could have with my tutor.
How did it work? Because I assumed that Thora, your mother, was working all over the place, not just here at Elstree. So how were you, as a young woman, young girl, able to do what you were doing while your mum was elsewhere doing what she was doing?
Actually, I was very lucky, because when I went back to regular school in between films, I was always top of the class, because I'd had individual one-on-one lessons. But my lovely dad, who had had to take a job in a bank after the war, and he was a musician, so he wasn't really all that happy in the bank, gave up his job in the bank and looked after me, managed me, I suppose you could say, until I was an adult. So he was always with me, protecting and caring.
And how important do you think that was in your relationship with him, having him by your side all those years?
Oh, we were incredibly close. We really were. And, of course, as I grew up and matured, he then sort of segued between my mother and myself, looking after her as well. And it was a great family business.
And your mother was doing, obviously, films elsewhere and theatre elsewhere?
And a lot of theatre, a lot of theatre in London.
Did you see her at all during those years, or?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. All the time.
So
she was mum at home, or, you know.
Well, she lived in the Mews
yes.
home. And we've got these images of you practising your dancing in the garage of the Mews home.
That's right.
So you managed to stay together as a family unit.
Yes, yes.
Did you find you enjoyed the industry?
I did very much. In fact, it's bittersweet coming back and talking to you about it now, because, of course, I'm a retired lady of leisure. But having started so young and been working in films so young, sometimes I feel I'm the only one left, because everyone I met and worked with have gone on elsewhere. But they live on the silver screen, and that's great.
Did you meet any big names at the time that you knew were big people?
Well, I don't know that I necessarily knew they were big people, but for instance, when I made that first starring film, No Place for Jennifer, in the next set was a film called The Hasty Heart, and that was Richard Todd's first film, and Ronald Reagan was in it, and I used to see him almost daily at lunch. The President of the United States, he became, of course. And then in later years, let's see. Well, of course, I made films in many other studios as well. But I remember one time when I was 12, I think it was, I'd just made a film called No Highway with James Stewart and Marlene Dietrich at Denham Studios, and I'd been called back into Elstree Studios to have some stills taken. In those days, there used to be so many film magazines that they were constantly hungry for pictures. And Mario Zampi was making a film on the next set, and I went in to see him because there were lots of people I knew in there, including, it was a nightclub scene, so there were lots of young people around. And when I left the studio that evening, it was pouring with rain, and I don't know whether there is now, but there used to be a bus stop just outside the gate. And standing at this bus stop in the pouring rain was this poor girl that I had seen on the set in a film called Laughter in Paradise, I think it was. So I asked the driver to stop, and I said, "I'm going into London, can I give you a lift?" She said, "Oh, that would be great, thanks so much." So on the way into London, we were chatting quite a bit, and I told her I was going back to school the next day. And it turned out she was a dancer, and she was in the chorus at Pigalle nightclub. And she was really nice. And so we drove her to the nightclub, and she was very pleased because she'd managed to get a second day of filming. That meant 2 days of pay, which was great. And I wished her well. And about maybe 18 months later, I was so pleased to read that my friend, the chorus girl, had managed to get a contract with Paramount to make a film in Rome with Gregory Peck called Roman Holiday, and it was Audrey Hepburn.
Audrey Hepburn. Whatever happened to Audrey Hepburn?
Whatever. I was a fan of hers all my life, all her life. And I saw her a couple of years later at I think it was the premiere of War and Peace. And she came up and she said, "Oh, how you've grown." And we had a lovely little chat, and she hadn't forgotten the lift.
You met Gregory Peck as well, didn't you?
I did. I had my 16th birthday party here at the studios, of course. And Gregory Peck was making Moby Dick on one of the sets. I remember the studios were intensely proud because they'd built a huge, great sort of tub full of water at the back of the studios to do the whale sequences in Moby Dick. And Gregory and Richard Basehart came to my 16th birthday party. My birthday is quite near Christmas, so there was mistletoe hanging up, and Gregory Peck kissed me under the mistletoe, which I lived off at school for many weeks.
Did you want to stay in film, or did you ever feel you wanted to go into the theatre like your mother had done, or traverse the two?
Well, I did do some theatre. I played Peter Pan. I was the youngest Peter Pan on stage ever at that time. I think I was 17. And I played the London Palladium, and I did several plays in London's West End. But my big love was always films, maybe because I knew so much about them. I remember Marlene Dietrich teaching me about the different lenses that can be used on the camera, and to always ask what lens was being used so that I would know how to graduate my performance accordingly. You know, I mean, a little flick of the eye when your eye is 10 feet across on a huge screen can make a huge message come across, you know.
People assume, don't they, that everyone is taught the skills of acting. Were you taught, or did you pick it up as you were going along?
I picked it up, but, well, I learned by doing.
Yeah.
I didn't really have much time to learn by not working because I was working.
And you made the transition, of course, as you said, you were here from when you were 9 till you were 20, so that's from a child to a woman. Were the parts changing for you? Did you notice that they were being written in different ways? How did you make that change?
I didn't make the change. I just naturally grew up. But in that sense, the studios themselves were very caring about what I did and how I did it. And I had my first screen kiss in a film called Now and Forever, made at Elstree Studios when I was 17, I think, Mario Zampi, and that was a very carefully made film that actually it won prizes in quite a few film festivals all over the world.
They did keep you very busy, as you said before, about all the pictures that were being taken. And it's amazing the images that we've now found of you over the years of just so much PR going on. Were you aware that you were part of a big PR machine?
I wasn't aware then, but looking back, I realise I was now. Yes, you know, I mean, it's... I hate to compare it to growing up during World War II, but it's sort of similar because the first world I was aware of, World War II was happening, and I know it sounds silly, but I sort of took air raid sirens and gas masks and houses disappearing across the road for granted. I mean, that was the world I was growing up in. So, and in a similar sort of way with films, it was the world I was growing up in. I didn't know that there was anything else that I certainly wanted to be involved in.
Did you work at all with your mum in film?
She was in several of the films that I made.
Yeah.
The only time we seriously worked together, other than her doing little parts in films, I think she was in Now and Forever, she was in The Good Companions. But serious jobs. We did a couple of plays together on television.
Did you enjoy that?
Very much, yes. Yes, we did. You know, being a mother and daughter, there was never any contest between us. We were just enjoying it.
She told me it was one of her proudest moments of everything she did, and she had a big filmography and television history. She said working together with you on television in a play in the late 50s, I think it was, she said was one of her proudest moments.
That would have been Delderfield's The Queen Came By.
That's the one.
Which she had had a big success with in the West End. Yeah. I was not in that, but when the production was done on television later, I was in it. One
of the great and fun films that you made here was The Good Companions, which I think your mother was in as well. Do you remember making that musical here?
That's right, and Celia Johnson. And I was so looking forward to meeting her, because Brief Encounter is still today, one of my favourite films.
What was it like when you met people who you'd actually admired, sort of heroes of yours? Did you find that a fun experience, a happy experience?
Yes and no. Sometimes, being a child performer, you can really tell the great ones from the not-so-good ones, because the great ones will give you the time of day, and if you're working in a scene with them, they'll really look in your eyes and really communicate. Not-so-good ones will think, oh, this is a child. I'll talk to the director, I'll talk to the lighting man, you know. But it made a great difference to me when I was a child performer to have someone actually talk to me and communicate with me. And I remember those people so well.
Another lovely film you made was called The Devil's Disciple.
That's true. That was made at Elstree. Yeah. That was with... of course, the George Bernard Shaw play was made with Kirk Douglas, Burt Lancaster, and Laurence Olivier. I was very lucky to get that part. I tested with some other very well-known actresses who tested, and I'm afraid to say that I drove Laurence Olivier balmy because my dressing room was next to his, and I was going through a phase of Lonnie Donegan and skiffle music. And apparently I played Lonnie Donegan far too loud.
What a cast.
I know, an amazing cast. And actually, I haven't seen that film since it came out. And that's a long, long time ago. I'd be interested to see it again now and see how it stands up.
A slightly probably lower budget film, but still a great classic British comedy now, highly regarded, is a film called School for Scoundrels.
I believe it's a cult classic.
It is indeed.
Morris.
It certainly is in my house.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
And it's still very much loved. And in fact, one of the reasons you're here today is because you're going to see a screening of it in front of 200 people who are very keen to see this film, where it was actually shot in places near to the studios.
That's
Do you recall
right.
making the film?
I do indeed. Terry Thomas and Ian Carmichael. We had made several films together before School for Scoundrels at Shepperton Studios and at Twickenham. The three of us had made films. Let's see what to remember about it. By the way, do you know it ran for over a year on the Champs-Élysées in Paris?
Why do you think that is?
I think the French people thought, this is what we enjoy about the English.
Either very simple or we're cads.
Yeah, exactly. Ian Carmichael, who I worked with many times apart from that, was always professional and lovely, and we were terrific friends. Terry Thomas was actually my next-door neighbour in a mews in London. And Terry was fun up to a point, but if he'd had a liquid lunch, it was rather difficult to get any real work done in the afternoons. After School for Scoundrels, I went on and made another film with just Terry Thomas called His and Hers at Elstree. Yeah. But I think we won't talk about that one.
We'll pop back to School for Scoundrels in that case.
Yes.
The tennis court sequences, it's quite wonderful to be able to see that the hotel, it wasn't a hotel and it was a gentleman's club where you were filming, still looks very much like it did almost 60 years ago. It's a listed building.
I'm glad.
And it will be very interesting to watch the reaction of people sitting there and actually where those scenes were shot. I suppose when you look back, it's easy to say, well, that's a highly regarded film, or that one was, that one wasn't. But at the time, did you ever get the feeling that this is going to be great or this is going to be not so good, different types of films you make?
I had high hopes for every single film I ever made. But of course, once one got into the role of making them, and you could see the cast, and you had a pretty good idea by the end of the shooting whether they were going to be just a run-of-the-mill film or whether they were going to be perhaps something with something a little special.
Did you ever come and watch the rushes at the end of the day? Yeah.
Rushes were the next day. They weren't the end of the day. And I'd watch anybody's rushes. Yeah. I think that was a wonderful way to learn, actually, to see rushes. That is what you've shot the day before, all the different angles of the camera and so forth, and a big learning experience.
A couple more films to mention, just two more. First one is also become a bit of a cult film. It's called Day of the Triffids, which wasn't made here, but it was a sort of a science fiction type horror film.
We interrupt our program to remind you that the spectacular display of meteorites is still turning the night sky into a blazing display of fireworks. All over the world at this moment, astonished...
It was made at Boreham Wood, just across the road.
Nearby. Do you recall making Day of the Triffids?
I do.
What can you tell us?
Well, my part of Day of the Triffids, which took place in a lighthouse with a wonderful actor called Kieran Moore, who I also went on to play with in other films, in Spain actually, was directed by Freddie Francis, who I had worked for before in a film called Paranoiac with Oliver Reed. And the story goes that The Day of the Triffids was made by an American firm. The rough-cut film was sent back to America, and the money men sat and looked at it, and somebody said, this is meant to be a horror film, and that's what it is. Horrible. You've got to do something with it. So all of a sudden, up comes little Jan and Kieran Moore in a lighthouse. And Freddie Francis is asked if he will direct this totally separate story that will be slotted in to the original film. And Freddie says, yes, if I can cast it, and immediately gets on the phone to me and to Kieran and says, listen, will you do me a favour? And along we went to Boreham Wood Studios and did our part of The Day of the Triffids, and never met, although I did years later, never met Howard Keel or Nicole Murray, our so-called co-stars in the film.
Didn't know that.
Ha-ha!
You mentioned Paranoiac,
Yeah.
and that was it was a Hammer horror film.
It was indeed, it was.
And that
yeah.
really felt like you were trying to break away from these nice, pretty, prissy roles into something far more dramatic. What was it like working with Oliver Reed and the cast?
Actually, we got on very, very well. But I hope well, it's many years later, and dear Ollie has been dead a long time, but he fell for me a bit, quite a lot, as a matter of fact. So when I went, after making Paranoiac, to make The Day of the Triffids at Boreham Wood, he began appearing on the set, and finally he made such a fuss that he got barred from the set. And so we never had a little love affair or anything, but he wished for it, shall I say. And that was the last I saw of Oliver Reed, being barred from the set of Day of the Triffids.
So Thora Hird could have been Oliver Reed's mother-in-law.
Gosh, there's a thought.
That sounds like a plot in its own right. You left the industry fairly soon after that. I mean, you'd done 25 years, but you were still only in your 20s. Why did you leave?
I left because, in a strange way, I felt I'd had a career, and I very much wanted to marry and produce babies instead of films for a while. So I married a brilliant musician and singer and entertainer called Mel Tormé, and lived in Beverly Hills and brought up two terrific children who now continue, and they're now the fourth generation in the business.
Did you ever want to go back to it?
No, you know, on occasion I see films and think, gosh, I could have done that rather well. But I've never had the desire to actually go back. I've got a very full life, and I enjoy being a retired lady of leisure in the English countryside.
And William, your husband, you've been with now for over 35 years?
A long, long time.
Is it true he didn't know you as an actress?
That's true. As a matter of fact, I think he's maybe only seen me in a couple of films that just happened to come up on television while we were watching.
Does it surprise you that after all this time you get so many letters and communications from people who are saying, we watched these films, we loved them 50, 60 years ago? Does the advent of DVD and Blu-ray sort of bring a new generation of fans to you?
It does. As a matter of fact, I still get quite a lot of fan mail from all over the world, curiously. At the moment, I think I must be very big in penitentiaries in the USA, because I keep on getting a lot of pictures being sent to me, asked for me to sign them, and I look at the return addresses, and it's sort of cell number whatever, you know.
Well, it's felt anything but a prison today. It's felt as though you've been among family, and we'd be delighted to welcome you back to Elstree this time. So, Janette Scott, thank you very much for coming in today.
Thank you, Morris.